All right. So we're here. Obviously, Wednesday we're going to finish up They Shall Run, but today I want you to pay attention to the young novelist that we have here today. I say young, but she's, I'm older than her, so I can say that all day long, right? Younger. I met. Let's give him your name again. Iromuanya, something like that. I mess it up every time, but I met Julie years ago when she was beginning, just starting out, but maybe not, on her journey. And I was the editor of the journal, and I met her through her words. I didn't even know who she was. You know what I mean? And so we kind of developed a good friendship just through, her submissions and her work and just being admired of what she does and being a really great storyteller. And so I definitely, knew one day that this book was going to be a possibility. It never crossed my mind that it wasn't. It just didn't. All right. So guess what? Julie work has appeared in Tampa Review, Passages North, the Kenyon Review, and the Cream City Review. Hey, I'm coming out there the next issue, among other publications. She earned a PhD from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Are you in Kwame Dawes School? Oh, okay. And is currently an assistant professor at University of Arizona. Formerly, she was at Northeastern Illinois University. She's at Arizona and teaching an MFA program, and she teaches Africana literature. Mr. and Mrs. Doctor is her first novel. So Julie's going to come up and read about 25 minutes. Please give her your undivided attention and then some more. Come on up, Julie.
Hi, everyone. Is that good? Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you, Randall, for bringing me out. Thank you all for coming. I know that you all were forced to come, but I appreciate having you here, and I appreciate your attention also. So the first question that I always get asked, and get asked it a lot of times, is the pronunciation of my last name, so I will tell it to you again. First name is Julie, last name is Iromuanya. So Iromuanya. And that's, my family's from Nigeria, and they're of Igbo descent. And what it means is enemies are awake. So it's actually made up of 3 words. Enemies are awake. Iromuanya. So I'm going to read to you from Mr. and Mrs. Doctor. I'll just read to you from the beginning of the book, so I don't need to do a lot to preface it. I will say this, my advice, I was asked earlier about advice to give to writers, and one thing that I didn't say that I would encourage writers to do is to write boldly. When I first wrote this piece, I was really shy about having, about reading it to people, but you'll see why in a second. But I think that, for me and for who the characters were and for their story, it was important. So I'm just giving you that as the basis. Everything Job Obonaya knew about sex, he learned from American pornography. So on their first unchaperoned meeting, Job rushed his new wife, splitting her thin body against the papered wall of their lavish honeymoon suite at the Presidential Hotel in Port Harcourt, Nigeria. Job tore at her lacy pink panties and only released his lips from her face to haltingly shout, "You are the dirty slut girl." Evie punched his gut with the sharp heel of her sandal. He crumpled. Together they landed on the floor in a tangled heap, legs splayed in every direction. "You are ugly," she said, glaring at him. Potato sack head, stout shoulders, hog's gut, bushy curling eyebrows, thick glasses pushed into the lips of his nose. "Eh! And now I married a beast. I married a beast. Hey!" She wound up her fist and struck him squarely on an ear. Job clutched his throbbing ear. For a moment, he struggled to unwind the underwear from his wrists before handing them back to her. When Effie attempted to put them on, the ripped elastic band left the underwear lopsided on her hips. "You see what you have done, oh." She thought of the time and care she and Auntie had put into her appearance for this day. The matching underwear set, the hours cooking her hair in an egg-smelling relaxer and then curling it. Her lipstick and eyeliner were now a streaky veneer finish on her face. A solid fist banged at the door. Ify disappeared into the bathroom clutching at the panties. When Job opened the door, a man in a too-tight suit stared up at him with liquid eyes. Is everything fine, sir? The man took in Job's appearance. His trousers with the zipper open and belt dangling, his face prickling with beads of sweat, his slack, bare chest. A smile gradually spread over his face. Job cleared his throat and heard his father's voice in his ears. What is this? You have come to disturb me on the day of my honeymoon with this nonsense? No, sir. My apologies, sir, the man said. Job and the man stood in the doorway, awaiting the next line in the script. Finally, Job gently let the door close on the man's teasing grin. He turned back to Ify, who now sat on the bed with her legs crossed, her face turned away from him. He positioned himself so that his body was turned away from hers too, then gradually he made his way toward her. Still, she remained unmoved. His hand snaked toward her bare brown thigh. Her skin gleamed, shiny. Just before he touched her, his hand dropped short. He thought of her words. She had looked prettier in the photographs, even light-skinned, not this tall, skinny thing with no buttocks. She was lucky a man like Job Iromuanya would even consider her appropriate for marriage. Although Job's life had been bare in America, he had never convinced himself that what he felt was loneliness. She looked tossed apart to him, like the two legs of the goat his grandparents had butchered in honor of the engagement. On the day of the celebration, Job had stood back warily as the butcher knocked the goat unconscious before they pulled its insides apart and prepared it for roasting. He'd always loved goat meat, so much so that as a child he'd earned the nickname Onyohi, thief, from his mother and sisters, because he would always let his hand slip into the large pot and steal bits of meat as it cooked. Still, he'd wanted no part of the killing. I can give you back to your people, Job said. Ify turned a furious glare on him, one eye widening. Auntie and uncle would be angry with her. After all, they had found her a doctor husband who lived in America. He had even promised to send her to an American university so that she could be a nurse in his clinic. Auntie would say, how can you, an orphan, be so ungrateful? Auntie would say that all their hard work in raising her since her parents died had been in vain. Still, Ify could not take this. She was nearly 30, almost a decade older than he believed. Not a child. She would find her own way to her dreams without him. I will go, she said. Their bags were open on the floor of the hotel room. Ify began, indiscriminately, to dump article after article of clothing into her suitcase. Job saw his tan slacks disappearing into the bag. That belongs to me, he said. As if in rewind, Ify flung clothes out of the bag. It belongs to you, she said. It belongs to you. Job ducked, barely missing the flying clothes. Ify, he started. Then, clumsily, he added, darling. Although she didn't turn back, she stopped flinging objects from the bag. He thought of his virgin wife tensed against the wall and wondered. Surely she had been schooled in the responsibilities that came with marriage. But perhaps she hadn't. No one had explained it to him. He had been a boy of 19 when he first came to America all those years ago. Job sifted through his bags until, from far beneath the clothes and shoes, he produced a faded, well-worn magazine. He slid the magazine across the bed to Ify and flipped it open. It was a simple enough story. Page 1, the doctor and the patient. The caption read, Doctor, it hurts here, followed by, let me examine you. Ify flipped the page. The doctor's milky buttocks stared back at her. The patient had her arms and head back and was chortling wildly. What is this? Ify exclaimed. Was this how Americans paid for medicine? She covered her eyes, but couldn't help peeking through her fingers. She'd been with one man before, but it was over in seconds, and she'd never actually seen him completely disrobed. Suddenly, there was a flickering of lights, a gasp, and the room filled with darkness. They waited for the generator to click on, Ify curious to turn the page, and Job expecting to consummate the marriage without further complication. When the generator did not turn on, Job instead suggested that they leave the room for a meal. They ate at an outdoor restaurant, partially shaded from the elements by skinny frayed umbrellas. Fela Kuti roared from a radio. A big man in khaki pants and a loud printed shirt owned the restaurant. He wrapped Job in a thundering embrace. "Oga, doctor," he said, "Mr. Doctor, how long are you staying with us?" Job told him he was with his wife on honeymoon, and the man proceeded to rattle off all the years he had known Job and his family. "This man's father is my father's cousin. I have known him since before he could stand." Job ordered 2 Coronas. When the bottles arrived, sweating cool, wet pearls down the sides, he paid in US dollars. Ify and Job sat silently across from one another as he swallowed his Corona and then hers. Job sucked the layers of slippery flesh free of the fishbone as Ify nibbled. She sat quietly, thinking of the magazine, and wondered, is this how Americans pay my doctor husband? Light streamed in diagonally, cutting his face into odd patterns. His features seemed to surrender to his surroundings. Is this what America does to a man? Finally, she spoke, her voice low. Are Americans so poor that they must? She couldn't finish a question without thinking of the naked doctor and patient. She sipped the beer. Job sipped the beer and told her, money is time in America. Then he launched into telling her about the shops, the ladies' clothes, the shoes, and Ify was no longer listening. A beggar boy of perhaps 9 moved from table to table with a pan full of peanuts. His lean, meatless face was filled with long lashes, and his sinewy limbs were shiny and exposed through the holes in his wrinkled Michael Jackson T-shirt. Many of the dining couples flagged him away in annoyance or simply ignored him, but he refused to go unnoticed. He leaned into a table where a large woman and a thin man took up the seats. They were dressed well. He winked flirtatiously and clicked his teeth at the lady. "Ma," he said, smiling. "Ma." "I will buy you a fur coat," Job said to Ify. He would have to get one of fake fur. "Ma," the boy said again. "I'm not your mama," the woman said, drawing her wobbly chin back. "I'm not old enough to be your mama." Shifting her wig back, she turned away from him. "Ah, this foolish boy," the man said. Still, with his knees pulled close together, he smiled and hunched forward, scraping the floor with a cane. He was old enough to be the woman's grandfather, much older than Job. Ify wondered how this man and woman had met. Ify had met Job only once before their honeymoon. Even during the wedding, Job's junior brother had stood in while he was in America. All Ify had remembered from her one meeting with Job was that his face was nothing more than a jagged relief etched on the dark. He'd sat across from Ify, auntie, and uncle, all squeezed together on the smaller couch so that he could have the larger one. Auntie and uncle had unsuccessfully tried to borrow a generator for the occasion and had been forced to settle on kerosene. So they stiffly argued about NEPA, the oil truck driver strike, corrupt politicians, and the ongoing teacher strike, and a abashed explanation. The kerosene had scrubbed roughly at Ify's nostrils and throat. Outside, she'd heard the sounds of church services going on, despite the dark along the length of the street. Children had been playing outside, chasing the rooster, and dirtying their bony knees in the muddy roadway. She thought of how the ankles of the man who sat before her would, in light, appear like the children's, bloodied from the wet dirt road. Before they met, there were packages of gifts. At the time, Ify knew nothing of the letters, pictures, and conversations with the people who would become her in-laws. All her life, Ify had been instructed to tell neighbors, friends, age mates, that her father was away, whether they believed it or not. So she fooled herself into believing that the packages were from him, that he really did live in America or London or Germany, that he had never been arrested for suspicion of fraud, that he had never been investigated and then murdered before his arraignment. As her cousins paraded through the potholed streets of their neighborhood in blue jeans and sweaters that were too big for their slight frames and too bulky for the thick Nigerian heat, Ify had imagined her father sitting behind a large desk in London, papers stacked neatly around him, awaiting his signature. Of the sweaters, blue jeans, and jewelry, Ify kept nothing except for a red gold-chained handbag that she took out only for to church and today. Only after the package's contents had been spread across the couches did Auntie and Uncle inform her that a man was coming to visit her. Auntie had watched her closely that day. "You see all the good things we have done for you. You, a skinny girl with nothing, no parents have. And now you will see America. Ify needed to ask Job about this America. Before leaving her cousin's laughter, auntie's gossip, and uncle's stories, she needed to know everything. But the skinny bigger boy was standing at their table now. Ify began to shoo him away, but Job stopped him. The boy dumped the peanuts into his palms, tumbling his hands in such a way that he magically released the shells. He was grinning, proud of his work, but how could he be so pleased in his condition? She imagined him curled into a tight ball underneath a bridge near the hotel. The ground would be muddy, a deep red where the rain had softened the earth. If he slept deeply, he might not notice how close his face was to the water, the shit, the dead malarial mosquitoes. Ify shuddered. Instead of sitting at a fancy table alongside her doctor husband, she would have been under the bridge girl had it not been for auntie and uncle. The little boy before her, too small for his shirt, the shirt with all its holes. He would have gnats and lice in his hair, his skin, his lips chalky from the residue of dusty dirt. Job was still smiling in distracted amusement at the boy when Ify thrust forward the bowl of peanuts. Ngwa, go! The peanuts splattered across the table and the floor. The boy's eyes met Ify's in desperation for just a second before he averted his gaze to the ground in deference. The restaurant owner was on them in seconds. He knocked the boy's head with the back of his hand. Why must you disturb my customer? He is a doctor here from America for only a short time. I will beat you today. To Ify and Job, he said, I am so sorry. The boy tried to run, but the man shoved him to the ground with his foot and began to beat him. The boy whimpered and heaved tearless cries. No, sir. He turned to Ify. Sorry, auntie, he said. On his knees, he begged, his thin, quivering frame on the floor before her. Ify's voice was small as she spoke. Leave him. Everything stopped. A chill rose through her body. This was what it meant to be a big woman. Half bowing, half filling the bowl, the boy attempted to sweep up the mess as he left. He would go hungry for the rest of the day, maybe the rest of the week, without the money he would have earned from the peanuts. Leave him, Ify said again, with force. Ego, she said to Job. We will pay for the nuts. Job retrieved a few naira. He tossed them on the ground. Go, Ify said. Go! The boy collected the money and ran as fast as his bony legs allowed. When he was gone, the fat lady laughed into the skinny man's ears. The bartender brought Ify and Job 2 more bottles of Corona on the house. And Job said to no one in particular, in America, boys like that are in school. By the time they started back to the hotel, a steel gray had enveloped the orange sun as night began its descent. All around, the breeze interrupted the calm of long-necked palm trees. With their wares balanced on their heads, hawkers darted across the streets. Job's drivers swerved through the gaps in the roadway and practiced turns that knocked Job and Ify into one another. Each time they touched, Job felt the softness of her skin against his. He tried to reconcile this gentle touch with her harsh way with the boy, telling himself that he had been in America too long. Even the boy, with his tearless cries, had walked with his head erect. He would likely brag to the boys in his gang about how his crocodile tears had earned him double what they had earned. Now, more than ever, Job was glad to be home. When they reached the hotel, they did not immediately return to their room. Instead, they made their way across the marble lobby floor that Job explained was imported from Spain, France, somewhere like that. A dull light glowed from the gift shop across the lobby. The gift shop was a boxed-in room with shiny glass walls. From the outside, the glass walls, illuminated by shocks of overhanging lights, gave the illusion that the cramped space was larger than it actually was. Nearly every inch of its shelves was loaded with trinkets, jewelry, clay figurines, wood-carved masks. Paintings of women with baskets on their heads were hanging or leaned against the walls, filling every available space. As Ify gazed at the objects, her eyes stilled on a painting of a couple in an amorous embrace. Do you like? Job asked. No. A necklace of shiny shells and beads was the first item within Ify's reach. She grabbed it. For the first time, the storekeeper pulled away from the cash register and gave her attention to the pair. Ah, lady of fashion, she said. Up until then, she had been curtained behind the paintings across the room, her eyes idly following the couple as she leafed through a magazine. "You must buy the earrings and bracelets too, or it will not be complete." Without complaint, Job purchased the jewelry and handed it to Ify, mentally subtracting the cost from the wad of bills tucked away in his briefcase. When they left the gift shop, both knew that they would be heading to the empty room, the large bed tauntingly illustrating its sole purpose. Ify followed Job inside. Hot, stale air had settled for too long. Their bed had been remade, each pillow set delicately. The clothes Ify had thrown about the room were neatly folded into their suitcases. Even the magazine was packed away as if the morning had never happened, as if Job and Ify were entering for the first time. Ify set her handbag down and sat on the bed, the tiny package in her hands. "Will you not try them?" Job asked. Ify wordlessly unraveled the necklace, earrings, and bracelet. She slipped the earrings and bracelet on without trouble. But when it came to the necklace, she struggled. Her back and shoulders relaxed under Job's hands as he tried his fingers over the clasp. Finally, he managed to connect it. He stepped back swollen with a small success. It was beautiful. When Ify rose to make her way to the bathroom mirror, she could not move her neck. The clasp had caught on her hair. Job tried to pull it free, but Ify swung her arms wildly as if swatting a mosquito. "Leave me," she yelled. "Leave me, oh." Job yanked harder at the clasp. Suddenly, the necklace exploded, shells flying in every direction. Ify collapsed to her knees and began to pick up the shells. Impossible. She would be on her knees all night, like the boy in the restaurant. "Leave it," Job said. "I will buy another." Ify ignored him, silent tears spreading down her cheeks. When the lights went out again with a sudden whoosh, Job was relieved. In the darkness, Ify continued to feel her way to each shell. Job opened and shut drawers in search of matches or a lighter. In the bottom drawer of the bathroom sink, his fingers finally closed over a box of matches, slightly damp with a scent of cleaning fluids. He tried each match until he finally found one that worked and struck it. From there, he could just make out a raw, half-eaten candle, which he lit. With a backward swipe, Job erased the perspiration from his face. He decided that he would return her to her people and go back to America alone. His family could begin the process again, inquiring into the reputation of each prospective family, sending him snapshots of stoic women, their heads draped in wigs, coolly gazing past the flash of the camera. She should have been prettier, he told himself. After all, his family had made a point of forgiving her poverty. Her good name would do. She was tall by his family standards, lean in a way that made wrappers and dresses appear ill-fitting and silly. Still, her thinness was ideal for the blue jeans that American women wore. His father, who had never visited America but had watched every video cassette he had mailed him, had reminded Job of this. His grandmother had insisted her small buttocks would grow with the birth of their first child. "She is still just a child herself," she had explained. Ify's legs were bony and ridged at the knees, her face taut with strain around her eyes, as if she squinted furiously at everything. She was also not as light-skinned as his mother would have preferred, and her hair was not ideal, but Job reminded himself she wasn't ugly. Job sank down onto the toilet, striking his foot against Ify's bag and knocking the few articles of clothing, makeup, perfume, and jewelry loose. He began to place each item back in the bag, using the flickering light of the candle as a guide. Women with all their tools. Men didn't have it as easy. If a woman was fat, thin, too dark, too light, too short, too tall, there was always something she could do about it. His sisters, Jenny and Florence, had used lightning creams for years, wearing tall heels to compensate for the short frames and even slipping cotton balls into their bras. When they went to their rooms at night, they were his plain sisters with ashy skin and acne. But when they reemerged, they were something new. His fingers ran along a pearl necklace in Ify's bag. He'd sent it to her many months before. He remembered the awkwardness of picking it out at Walmart, the sales lady watching him closely as he gazed into the glass case. Now he lifted it against his hairy chest and clasped the ends behind his neck. Success. Why hadn't he been able to get it right when it mattered? With the pearls around his neck, he remembered the feeling he had the first time he wore a stethoscope. Strangely, it was just like this. The same satisfaction. A small smile grew on his face as he listened for his heartbeat once more. He was a boy the first time he'd heard the sound, the wonder, the amazement at a device that could track the rapid sound of his own music. His brother Samuel had smiled when Job asked if a small ear was in the tool. After the funeral, when Job was going through his brother's things in the room they'd shared, he found the stethoscope again. Job fingered and played with it, listening to the sound for a long time, enthralled. His mother came in then and saw him on his knees with his dead brother's things scattered around him on the floor. She beat him, asking, what was he thinking, playing with his brother's things? Samuel will be angry. Hurry, put it away, she had said, as if Samuel was among the living, as if he was still fighting for Biafra. After the beating was over and Job wept silently at his sister's side, his father called him over. Job's mother was turned away, her face set in a frown. His father had the box of Samuel's things. Choose what you like, he said to Job, and then I must never see you playing in this box, you hear? At first, Job didn't know what to do. He saw his mother with the look she made when she tasted something spoiled. So he waited, but he heard nothing. After a while, she turned to face him. Only then did he take the box. He went through it, lifting each object out slowly, examining it, deciding on its weight, its smell, its usefulness. Since the stethoscope was the start of all the trouble, he wanted nothing to do with it. Instead, he took a jazz record. He'd never heard it play, but he knew one day he would have the money to buy a music machine of his own. He also took a cricket mallet and ball. He would practice until he was better than all of his age mates. Samuel's trousers were too long, but he took them anyway, and his brother's hat, which he tipped forward on his head like his brother had. The brim dangled over his eyes. A smile twitched on his mother's lips, loosening the scowl, so he put on his brother's pants, adjusting his hips so that the waist gapped around his narrow body. Like the trunk of an elephant, the trouser legs bagged at his feet. His mother laughed and pulled him into her arms for a tight hug, her eyes wet with tears when she released him. He's not finished, his father had said. He pushed the box back toward Job. All that remained was the stethoscope. Job wanted nothing to do with it. Take it, his father had said. Job shook his head furiously. His father reached from him and put it around Job's neck. He put the ear tips in Job's ears, and then, kneeling before him, he placed his chest piece to his chest. Job heard no sound, so he adjusted the chest piece until he found the sound of his father's heartbeat, a dull, raspy thudding. Standing in the hotel bathroom on the night of his honeymoon, Job no longer replayed his memory of the stethoscope. Instead, he remembered his mother's laughter at the sight of his small frame in his brother's oversized clothes. She had gone from tears to anger to laughter just like that. But what had made her laugh? Was it merely the sight of him in his brother's clothes? It had to have been more than that. Job picked up Ife's perfume, sprayed it into the air, and sniffed. It smelled good. He twirled his fingertip in her rouge, absent-mindedly dragging a deep red line across the sink. Then, still staring at the streak, he began to spread the rouge on his cheeks, then his eyelids, and finally his lips. Laughing, he reached for her bra, thinking of his flat-chested sisters standing before the mirror as small girls. He put it on, filling each cup with toilet tissue. Ballooning his chest, he made motions like a woman, then a gorilla, then the Incredible Hulk. The little cups barely jiggled on his chest. He chuckled. How silly this was. But maybe, like his mother did, Ife would laugh. Perhaps, like his father did, Ife would hope. Thank you.
Another round of applause. Okay, look, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Generally, you gave us a good preface to the book. Would you mind explaining a little bit further in terms of, like, give us the story plot? And then also want to talk a little bit about, what I'm very interested in, how much were you influenced by, I guess, immigration novels,
Okay.
i.e., Jumper Lahari, you know, I guess we know where I'm going with that.
Yeah.
So talk about that, then sort of get into the other idea, what you were trying to do, and explain sort of like the experience coming to America from that lens.
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, Mr. and Mr. Doctor is about Nigerian immigrant couple. They're in an arranged marriage, so you all saw that first night alone together. Everything else has been arranged by their family, so really this is the first time that the two of them are in a room together. and they have to have sex, right? So it's this terrifying thing. And I think to tie this into Jhumpa Lahiri, you know, when I first started to work on this book, I knew I wanted this to be a couple that didn't know each other at all and were brought together by their families and all of their families' hopes and things like that. And then sort of the building of their own dreams kind of being conditioned by all of that. But I also went back to Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake, which deals with, again, a couple that comes together as immigrants. And I felt like so Lahiri, like myself, Jhumpa Lahiri, are y'all familiar with her? So she's yeah. Great movie with Cal Penn in it. I love Cal Penn. You guys need to read. Like when you leave, just come back. Some of you do, right? Some people are taking your classes who are not even enrolled, right? No, that's true. Yeah. So one of the things that Lahiri did was bring together this couple that were in an arranged marriage. And the thing she skipped over was that first night that the two of them were together as strangers. And I felt that that was an important piece. Because until that point, all they know is everything that's been told to them by their families, by their parents, by all these people who have arranged them, who feel that they're perfect for each other. But their reasons for thinking that they're perfect for each other have nothing to do with them as people, as individuals. And so I was really interested in putting those two people together. And then essentially the book is like this long blind date, because they get to America, and like every blind date, have you guys been on blind dates? No, really? None of you? Have any of you all like done the online dating thing? Or, okay, so I see if you not Tinder or any of that, perhaps Grindr or whatever. Match.com. Okay, so you guys are still the space where you just meet people, but when you get a little bit older, that's harder. So essentially, this is like one long blind date between these two people. And when someone is on a blind date, they tell each other great things. They tell each other all the wonderful things about each other. But then when you have to live with each other, the truth comes out. And so the book is really about what happens as the truth comes out about who each person is. The things that you kind of boast about or brag about, maybe those things are not really true. What happens as a result of that? And then if you're kind of stuck in the situation where you're together and you're in a new land together, how do you reconcile yourselves as a couple, as a unit, within a space that can often be hostile to you as a person of color or as an immigrant? And particularly in this case, we're set in the Midwest, in Nebraska, where they're really marginalized, and marginalized in multiple ways. Marginalized in terms of race, marginalized in terms of being immigrants, and marginalized also within the African American community as well for being Nigerians too. So, yes, I am. Yeah. So I was born and raised in Lincoln, Nebraska. My parents came there for education and then ended up staying on. Yeah. And so the book sort of deals with a lot of the complexities within that as well. Well, I could talk to you a little bit about one of the things that I tried to do with this first chapter was introduce like many of the main threads of the book. So some of them come in through, and I think we got through most of the first chapter. So the most obvious sort of main plot line is the two of them in this room together, and the sort of uncovering, right, and of what has been falsified or what has been presented earlier on. And one of the things that I started with was, in their initial kind of, the family brings them together, the way that it's presented is that Ife is presented to Job as, you know, here's a possibility. And for Job, when he's selecting a wife, he's given this like a stack of cards essentially with different women's faces on it, right? So what happens is a lot of the gaze is turned towards her, right? And a lot of it is about her physical appearance, what does she look like, and some of the other things that, you know, her family talks about, things that she can do domestically. She can sew well, she can cook, that kind of thing. And so one of the things that I tried to do in this chapter, at least toward the end of the chapter, is kind of turn the gaze so that it is more toward him, so that he becomes the object of inquiry. So in that first, you know, that opening scene, when they're looking at each other, it's Ife who is looking at him and saying, you know, he's ugly. he's got this like goat gut. And he's, what is this? This is the man that I got to marry. He's old, right? And so she compares him to the older man in the restaurant. It's like, well, he's a little bit not as bad as that guy. So some of that had to do with sort of thinking about repositioning the gaze. And like socially and culturally, right, we tend to do that to women. We tend to have the gaze on women's appearance. Y'all know, like in magazines and things like that, so much is focused on the woman. So I tried to sort of shift that gaze a little bit and put it on him. And it's an uncomfortable position for him. He kind of has a moment where he has to reconcile, what does he have then? Because he recognizes that she's not attracted to him, right? So what does it mean that she's not attracted to him? What is it that then he has to work with, and what does he sort of feel he lacks? So that's one of the main threads. But the other thread that I think is something that comes throughout the book, and it's sort of introduced here in the beginning, is the history of Biafra. And Biafra was the name of the nation in Nigeria. So Nigeria had its own civil war from 1967 to 1970. And essentially what happened was the Igbos, so I guess I should give you a little bit of a history primer. So Nigeria is made up of many different ethnic groups. There are like some estimates of 250 languages, some estimates go as far as over 400 languages spoken in Nigeria. But the three main ethnic groups, like the Hausa and Fulani up in the north, and then in the southwest are Yoruba, and then the southeast are Igbo. And what happened in 1967 and 1970 was 1966, 1967, the Igbo decided to secede. So they essentially tried to break off and form their own nation, and that nation was called Biafra. And so as a result of that, the Nigerian government wanted to stay contained as a nation. And so there was a civil war that ensued. And just, the thing about I guess I should say about the ethnicities that is important to also keep in mind is that Nigeria itself as a context, as a place, was something that was imposed, right? And we're all sort of familiar with the history of colonization. So you have all these different nations, all these different ethnic groups, different tribes within those ethnic groups. They had their own societies and their own cultural systems and ways of structuring society. And then this colonial force kind of brought them all together into a nation. And so there have always been, right? Yeah, so there's always been kind of tension between different groups and about how things should be run and so on. And so at this particular moment in history, Igbo Nigerians decided to secede and start their own nation. And so what you have as a result of that is, and this is coming across in a lot of works by Nigerian writers right now, is that generation that follows and sort of thinking about what happened, the memory of that, what was lost. It was a very brutal war. It involved many countries at different points. And so for Job, his brother Samuel is the first son. And in Nigerian families, the first son, and particularly in Igbo families, the first son has a very prominent role in the family. Right? He's the one who is the inheritor. The first daughter and first son are very important. When his brother ends up dying in the war, that role gets passed down to him, so he inherits it. But for him, it's always tense because he never feels quite like that role was for him. It was for Samuel. So he's constantly in this position of trying to, essentially fit, sort of figuratively fit into his brother's shoes or into his clothes. And in this first scene, we see him, trying those clothes on as a young child and being essentially handed down that stethoscope because his brother is the one who should have been the doctor. Now you will be the doctor. Now the family's hopes are on him for their future. And so those are a couple of the main threads that sort of carry through the book. And there are many others as well that relate specifically to their experience in America and some of the hostilities that they face as immigrants in America.
That's a very interesting point. Going back a little bit about the ways in which immigrants are discriminated against, not only from those within the dominant narrative, but also minority groups as well.
Right.
You think that they will make this movie more comfortable.
Right.
You find that whole thing too. But then even when you go hit on the groups, they still.
Right.
So it's very complicated all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
So you kind of answered or alluded to this a little bit, talking about the Biafra, but when we were speaking with you earlier, you told us how before the book was actually complete, it took you like 15 years to get to this point. So do you feel that
Wait, you didn't write last week?
no, it was like a long I know. But do you feel that whether it was your personal experiences, the people that you have met over the years, the knowledge that you have acquired, do you think that all of that has helped to finalize your book?
Absolutely. So all of my experiences, and I think for all of you, many of you are writers in the crowd here, your experiences inform your writing. Like, even if you try not to do it, even if your subjects have nothing to do with your own life, they'll find their ways in. And so the book certainly changed a lot over the years. When it started off, it was just a character sketch, and then it became a short story, and then from a short story, I was like, this is a novel, and so I kept writing, and then it's been revised many times, and I've looked at it, and others have looked at it, so certainly it's changed a lot. But when I started the book, and when I started that initial character sketch, the character Job was essentially like a composite of many like bachelor men, Nigerian men that I had known growing up that were family friends, who had never been married and who lived in America, and who, if you know this, often when, immigrants come to America and they're on their own, often what their job is to do, or what gives them a sense of pride, is their ability to support their family back home. So Job's role, and many of these family friends we know, is they would work super hard, just constantly around the clock, and most of the money they made, they send back home to their families. And they really don't, like, the conditions that they live in America are not very great. This is in particular for those who come and who are single, right? And so I wanted to sort of think about that kind of character and imagine what happens when his orientation changes a little bit, right? Because he's now getting married and now he's going to start his own family, but he also has the expectations and the hopes that have come with him from his family, and now his new wife, Ife, also has her own expectations and hopes as well. With Ife came much later. So Job had been with me for a while in various permutations and different exercises and short stories and things that I'd been working on. Ife really came to me when I went to Nigeria on a trip, maybe about 2005 or 2006. And I was staying with my aunt and her family, and they had a house girl who lived with them. And this is the case in a lot of developing nations, and this is something that, I guess in a way, it sort of works within that economy, where you have children who go work in people's households, and often that is so that they can have, somewhere to stay. And also, sometimes if they have really good people that they're working for, they'll also pay for their schooling. And the girl who was staying there was just this, just exuberant, cheerful kid. The first day that I showed up, I was like carrying these suitcases that were really heavy, and I was like struggling to get up the walkway. And this kid, she's a skinny little 13-year-old, maybe 12 or 13. She just marches up, grabs the bag, throws it on her head, and just marches off, and she's singing and whistling as she does it. So I was just really sort of stunned by the kind of strength that she had and the kind of dignity that she had. She would always like go around the house, and she'd have to clean and be whistling and humming the tune to Scooby-Doo, So she was just this really charming person, really, really interested in everything, and very smart. She was, she would help my cousin with his homework. She knew Igbo very well, and she also knew English very well, so she would do those, she'd help him with his schooling. And one of the things that I thought about was, so this also deals, again, within immigrant groups and within societies, sort of class distinctions. And I wondered what would take a girl in her situation, what would be the kind of thing that would allow her to ascend up the social ladder? And for someone like her, it would be through marriage, So obviously there are things that, within Ife's story, there are things about her situation that reduce her. The thing that she has is her family name. But everything else requires of her, that this is her way to her dreams, right, to marry this man, even if she doesn't quite want it. It's one of the things that she comes to recognize. And she kind of has an ugly moment in this chapter, because up until that point, she's sort of like, I don't know if I want any part of this. But she kind of gets seduced by what it means to be a big woman, right? What it means to have power, which is something that she hasn't had. And so I was sort of interested in thinking also about how, so power corrupts him in certain ways, but power also corrupts her as well.
All right. One last question because I got the board a minute. Character names.
Okay, yeah.
Anything special with that?
So
You
the
know, I'm looking at Job, looking at Ethan.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make some
Yeah.
connections. Yeah, you know, you can't get away like that.
so Job and Ephi are one couple, and then the second couple in the book, which we didn't get to in this first chapter, Gladys and Emeka. You know, and so I kind of did this flip thing, but with Job, y'all are familiar with the biblical sort of the idea that this horrors are kind of heaped on his back, but it's also a little bit ironic because some of it is Job's own doing. He gets himself into some trouble.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just know he's gonna lose.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so look, let's give Julie a nice round of applause. And thank you for coming. And here we got